Earlier in this chapter, we already mentioned that encryption gives us a way to constrain who is able to receive a given message. We also may need to constrain the set of senders of a message. In other words, to know for sure that the sender is a particular person or one of a limited set of people. We call this function authentication. And authentication goes hand in hand with encryption. Sometimes they amount to the same thing. For example, the mere fact that we can decrypt an asymmetrically encrypted message means that we know who the sender is, or at least that they're among the set of people who hold the specific encryption key. Authentication is used to prove who the sender of a message is, and can also be used to prove that the message has not been altered in any way. The components of an authentication algorithm are a set of keys, K, a set of messages, M, and a set of authenticators, A. An authenticator is a value computed from a message that ensures that the sender has the specific key. Because the authenticator may be transmitted over the same medium as the messages themselves, it should not be computationally feasible to derive the keys from the authenticators, or the messages. But it needs to be computationally efficient to generate the authenticators from messages and keys, in other words, to compute the S function, and to verify the authenticators against the messages to ensure they match, in other words, to compute the V function. In general, message authentication is based on hash functions, which we mentioned before with respect to hashed page tables in Chapter 8 and hashed implementations of disk directories in Chapter 11. A hash function, in this case, takes a message and computes a small, fixed-size block of data from it. We call this a hash value or message digest. Provided our hashing algorithm is collision resistant, which is to say it is not feasible to come up with another message that hashes to the same value, then we know that if the hashes match, the messages must match too. To prevent someone from intercepting the message and modifying it, and modifying the hash value too such that it matches, the hash value itself is encrypted before being sent. In general, there are two kinds of authentication algorithms, just as there are two types of encryption algorithms. The first type is called a Message Authentication Code, or MAC, and it is based on symmetric cryptography. Because of this, the keys and the S and V functions must be kept secret. The S function that generates the authenticators is executed on a hash of the original message. Because we use a collision-resistant hash function, we can be reasonably sure that no modified message would give the same MAC. The main issue here is making sure K is kept confidential, because if you can compute V of K, you can also compute S of K, and vice versa. The second major type of authentication algorithm is a digital signature algorithm, which produces authenticators called digital signatures. Imagine that. This is based on the same concepts as asymmetric encryption. In particular, it avoids the problem with MAC where V sub k can be derived from S sub k. Here, V sub k is a one-way function, meaning it can be computed efficiently, but S of k can't be computed from it in a feasible amount of time. There is an RSA authentication algorithm that works basically the same as the RSA encryption algorithm, except that the usage of the keys is reversed. The key K sub S that is used to compute the digital signature is analogous to the public key used to encrypt a message, and the key K sub V used to verify the digital signature is analogous to the private key used to decrypt a message. Why do we treat authentication separately from encryption if encryption can be used to verify the sender of a message? Our author gives three reasons, which come down to more efficiency due to better use of resources, computational and data transmission. Our authors also note that authentication can be used to provide non-repudiation, or proof that you authorized something. One big use for asymmetric encryption is to enable the secure distribution of the keys used for symmetric encryption, which is computationally more efficient, but requires no one but the sender and recipient having access to the keys. One way to keep the keys secret is out-of-band distribution. In other words, not using the network that will be used to send information to deliver the keys. For example, we could send them on paper via snail mail, or give them orally in person or over the phone, or provide them on a flash drive, etc. However, out-of-band distribution tends to not be very efficient for large-scale distribution. So, using asymmetric encryption to deliver the keys for symmetric encryption and then using it for the actual data communication may be the more efficient way of handling things. But even here, we need to be careful to use some form of authentication to make sure the real public keys are delivered from the intended recipients and used by the sender to encrypt the messages. The potential problem is that an attacker could get in the transmission path and intercept a remote site's public key and substitute a bad key, in other words, his or her own key. If the sender then used that key to encrypt his message, then the attacker could decrypt it. And if that message contained the secret symmetric key being distributed to the other party, the attacker could decrypt messages sent using that form of encryption too. So we need some way of reliably determining who owns a given public key. A common way to handle this is the use of digital certificates. These are digital public keys that are digitally signed by a trusted party known as a certificate authority. These are generally reliable, bonded companies. These authorities require proof of identity from a person or company seeking a digital certificate. They then certify that a specific public key belongs to a specific entity. The authorities themselves provide their public keys directly to Microsoft, Google, Mozilla, and so on, so they can be delivered as part of the browser. They can vouch for other entities, who can in turn vouch for others, and so on, creating a web of trusted sites. There is a standard format called X.509 that is understood by all the major browsers that is used to encode the digital signatures. Our textbook describes the workings of SSL, which is a cryptographic protocol used to communicate securely between two computers, specifically a client and a server. This is the protocol used for encrypted communication between a web browser and a remote web server. For example, when you transmit your credit card information to a merchant to buy something online, or when you log into MyMoxNet to register for classes or check your grades. Basically, it initially uses asymmetric cryptography to establish a secure link for sharing a session key, which is then used to do symmetric encryption of data transmitted from one end to the other. The session key is used only once and is discarded after the session is over. Of course, being able to verify the integrity of information exchanged between computers doesn't do much good if just anyone can gain access to the computers. So a major issue for operating systems is, how do we make sure a user is who he or she says he is? Our book tells us that user authentication basically boils down to one of three things: having something, knowing something, or being something. In other words, possessing some object such as a key or card, knowing a username and password, or having a biometric identifier such as a fingerprint or retina scan. Probably the most common method for user authentication is passwords. In order to be granted access to a system, a person who gives a certain username has to supply the password that matches it. Passwords are so widely used because they are easy to understand and implement. However, in practice, they have lots of vulnerabilities. Perhaps the most obvious is that passwords that are easy for the legitimate user to remember are also easy for an attacker to guess. Believe it or not, some of the most common passwords chosen by the users are the word password and the sequence of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Of course, those are the ones any attacker would try first when attempting to gain access to somebody else's account. Often people will use their spouse's or kids' or pet's name as a password, or their phone number or zip code, the kind of information that is easy to find out about them. Even if users choose non-obvious passwords, they may not be secure if they are too short. If a password contains only a few characters, an attacker may be able to brute force guess it just by trying all possible combinations. To make this more difficult, we can either use more characters or more possibilities per character. For example, both upper and lowercase letters, plus possibly numbers, plus special characters such as plus, equal, at, pound sign, underscore, percent, and so on. By including a variety of characters in the password and making it fairly long, 8 characters or more, the user can make it much more difficult to guess. Of course, guessing isn't the only way an attacker can gain access to a password. It can be as simple as looking over someone's shoulder as they log in, or setting up a hidden camera to watch them typing, or installing a keystroke logging program, or sniffing passwords off a network. Encrypting passwords before they are transmitted can help avoid this method. Maybe the easiest way to get unauthorized access by stealing a password is simply to search the user's work area, because many people write their passwords down. This can be an example of how measures intended to make systems secure can actually backfire. Many organizations, our university among them, require users to change passwords periodically, and also don't allow the last several passwords to be reused. This seems like a good idea on the face of it, but most people can only remember a limited number of passwords. Once they are forced to change a password they had memorized for a new one different from any they have ever used before, they are much more likely to write the new one down. And of course, there is always the possibility that users will share passwords and thus accounts with friends or family members on purpose. This seems harmless, but you never really know what a friend or relative might do, either accidentally or on purpose, and end up getting you blamed for. Given that passwords themselves are secure, we still have the question of how does the system securely store and check passwords? We certainly wouldn't want to store them in a plain text file and do a straight-up match between that information and what's typed into a login prompt. Many systems, Unix and Linux in particular, encode the passwords using some sort of hashing or encryption algorithm that is easy to compute but difficult or impossible to do the computation in reverse. In other words, a one-way function. All stored passwords are encoded with this function, and all passwords typed in are also put through the same algorithm, and the encoded values are what are compared to determine whether the user is legitimate. This scheme works well enough, but if someone can steal the password file, they can run lists of potential passwords through the same encryption algorithm, the one Unix uses is well known, and compare the encrypted results against the encrypted information in the file and look for matches. A match of encrypted values means the plaintext values must match too. Newer versions of Unix and Linux combat this threat by making the password file accessible only by the superuser root, and by adding a random value that is predetermined for this specific system, called a salt value, to modify the password before encrypting it, so the algorithm won't give the same encoded value for the same password as it would on another system. Other possible password schemes that can be used to try to improve authentication security include the use of paired passwords, where the system supplies one of many challenge values in prompting the user, and the user must respond with the password corresponding to the value displayed. The next time the user tries to log in, a different challenge will be issued, which will require a different response. The relationship between the challenge and response could be in the form of an algorithm that the user knows and is programmed into the system. A simple example would be x squared plus 1. If the pairing algorithm is x squared plus 1, one time the user might be prompted with 7, and so he or she would use 50 as the password. The next time the user might get the prompt 12 and respond with 145. Obviously, for a real implementation, we would want the algorithm to be more complex and less guessable. Some systems use two-factor authentication, such as requiring both a password and a PIN code. This way, if either factor by itself is compromised, the attacker cannot gain access. An example of this here at UTC is the way you, as a student, register, add, or drop classes. You have to log into the system using your UTC ID and password, but then to access the registration system, you have to have your advisement code, aka alternate PIN. No one can drop or add classes for you without knowing both your password and alternate PIN. Perhaps the most secure authentication schemes are biometric, where authentication depends on some physical characteristic of the user, such as a fingerprint scan. Legitimate users' biometric information is input into the system and then compared against the biometric information of a person trying to gain access. The hardware and software needed to do this has traditionally been too expensive for widespread use, but the cost has come down a lot in recent years, and this will likely be used more widely in the future. Perhaps the most secure approach is to combine several factors, such as a username, password, fingerprint, and a special RFID card or USB key or something like that for multi-factor identification that would be very hard to compromise. So how, overall, do we approach computer system security? One commonly accepted overall principle is defense in depth. Having multiple layers of security, such that if an attacker makes it through one barrier, there is something else for him or her to contend with. It's the same concept behind a football team not playing all its defenders on the line of scrimmage. If they did that, a runner who was able to break through the line might go untouched for a score. So they have defensive linemen who try to stop the ball carrier, but behind them they have linebackers in case he gets through, and behind them are safeties in case the linebackers miss the tackle. In the context of home security, this is analogous to having locks on your doors, backed up by an alarm system, backed up by a big dog, backed up by you in the bedroom with a shotgun. Probably the first step, as our authors tell us, is to have a security policy stating what is being protected, what users are required and not required, allowed or not allowed to do. People need to know what the policy is. That doesn't guarantee they will abide by it, but at least they won't be able to claim ignorance. The next thing you probably would want would be to do a vulnerability assessment, where you examine your systems for weaknesses or vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited by an attacker. You have a security policy in place. How well does the actual state of the system reflect that policy? Some of the things you might want to check for would include short or easy-to-guess passwords, unauthorized privileged programs, unauthorized programs and system directories, unexpectedly long-running processes, improper directory protections on user and system directories, improper protections on system data files, dangerous entries in the program search path, changes to system programs detected with checksum values, and unexpected or hidden network daemons. Obviously, if the system is connected to a network, then any vulnerabilities that relate to network access are some of the most serious to worry about, since they can be exploited from far away, from anywhere in the world if there is an accessible internet connection. Physical access to the system is not required, so your vulnerability assessment would have to look closely at all ways network connections can be established. Another thing to do when trying to secure any system is intrusion detection. The idea is we want to detect instances when some attacker has tried, successfully or unsuccessfully, to gain unauthorized access. There are many different types of attacks and, of course, many different ways to try to detect them, as well as deal with them once they are identified. We want to know when attacks happened, hopefully in real time, but at the very least after the fact. We also want to know what type of intrusion was attempted. One way to try to determine the type of the intrusion is to use signature-based detection, where certain patterns of behavior are interpreted as indicative of certain attacks. Another approach is anomaly detection, where we look for behavior that is simply different from normal system usage patterns. Different behavior doesn't automatically mean bad behavior. In other words, this approach may generate false positives. But in this approach, we assume that different from normal behavior should at least be looked at to see if it's malicious. One advantage of anomaly detection as intrusion detection is that it can be used to detect brand new, previously unknown, what we refer to as zero-day attacks, for which there is not yet an attack signature. Of course, this method means we need to benchmark the system to establish what normal activity looks like, and we would need to establish thresholds for just how different from normal things have to be before we sound the alarm. This means that we run the risk of both false positives, triggering on things that are not attacks, and false negatives, missing the subtle signs of an actual attack that does not cause a significant enough variation from normal behavior. False alarms can be very costly if they cause system administrators to spend a lot of time evaluating them, and they can also lead to future real intrusions not being detected if the admins decide to ignore things that look like previous false positives. Obviously, virus protection, which we mentioned before, is a major component of an overall system security plan. both free and commercial programs exist that will scan for and disinfect systems if any viruses are found. We need to make sure the definitions or virus signatures are kept updated as new viruses are constantly appearing. And one other thing we may need to do is have the system keep a log of significant events that occur. Logins, system calls, ports open, telnet sessions, file modifications, and so on. We want to account for all these events and periodically audit the logs to look for suspicious activity. This causes overhead and uses resources, but can be very useful for security analysis. One thing we frequently do to try to keep computers secure when they're connected to an insecure network, such as the open internet, is to set up a firewall. This is a piece of hardware and/or software that sits between the secure computer or network and the outside world or insecure network. The firewall monitors and controls what accesses can occur between the trusted side and the untrusted side, according to a set of rules we set up when we configure the firewall. We can set it up to only allow connections on certain ports and not others, or to only allow certain protocols to be established, for example HTTP and FTP but not Telnet, and to further restrict or allow access based on specific address ranges on the internal or external network. Of course, we need to watch out for attempts to tunnel through or spoof the firewall. A firewall can be used to set up multiple security domains, more than two. One common example is a third domain, the DMZ or Demilitarized Zone, that is an intermediary between the secure organizational network and the outside internet. Some connections may be routed to DMZ machines and only indirectly be allowed to communicate with machines on the trusted network, or only under certain specific conditions. The government, specifically the Department of Defense, has specified 4 security classifications for computer systems. In order from least secure to most secure, they are D through A. Systems in Division D have little to no security. Examples would be anything running MS-DOS or early versions of Windows. Class C systems are a bit more secure. Actually, this is divided into C1 and C2, which is more secure because it allows control and auditing at the level of individual users. Most versions of Unix are in the C1 class, while a few special secure versions of Unix are C2 level certified. Division B is partitioned into B1, B2, and B3, which add sensitivity labels to objects for more security. B3 is the most secure level of the 3. The highest level of system is Division A, which is basically a system at level B3 which has been designed and tested using formal design specifications and verification techniques. The last thing our textbook looks at in Chapter 15 is some of the techniques Microsoft used in Windows XP to help make it more secure. Some early versions of Windows had no concept of separate users. All settings and privileges were the same for anyone who used the machine. Windows XP has the ability to have a separate user account for each user, and each user can be assigned to groups and given or denied access to various objects in the system, for example files, printers, or programs. Each user ID has a security access token that is checked when he or she tries to access a resource to decide whether access is allowed or not. Windows XP uses subjects to keep track of permissions on each program a user runs. It makes sure the programs don't get a greater level of access than the user running them is supposed to have. In Windows XP, each object in the system has a security descriptor which contains several pieces of information, including the security ID of its owner, who can change permissions on it, a group security ID, an access control list for users and/or groups, and a system access control list for auditing purposes. Objects can be non-container objects, which are essentially standalone items like individual files, or they can be container objects that can include other objects. An example would be a directory, which can include files or subdirectories within it. By default, when a new object is created within a container, it inherits its permissions. This concludes our discussion of topics from Chapter 15.